Welcome to the Cannabis Cultivation and Science Podcast. I'm your host, Tad Hussey of Kisorganics. This is the podcast where we discuss the cutting edge of growing from a science-based perspective and draw on top experts from around the industry to share their wisdom and knowledge. Before starting the podcast, I wanted to share about an exciting new conference that we are hosting in conjunction with Collective Elevation in Bozeman, Montana. I've been talking to Suzanne Wainwright Evans, the bug lady, about hosting a conference for years, and Adam at Collective graciously offered to open up his doors and let us host it on his property. The event is happening September 5th through the 7th, 2025, and I'm super excited. We are kicking it off with workshops from the bug lady Suzanne and Dr. Nadia Saba, also known as Dr. Greenhouse, followed by a facility tour, and then a bunch of excellent speakers and networking events over the next 3 days. Then on the 7th, the Montana Living Soil Alliance is hosting a tasting event that will be included in the price of the conference ticket. The tasting event will be a private event with cannabis donated by the Living Soil Alliance as a way to have an amazing sensory experience and see what premium quality Montana Living Soil has to offer. Tickets are limited to 200 spots, so be sure to grab a ticket if you're interested. The tickets are now on sale at kisorganics.com, and the conference is called the Cannabis Cultivation and Science Conference. In honor of the conference, I wanted to do an interview series with some of the amazing folks at Collective Elevation to give a grower's perspective and share some of what they've been able to accomplish. I've already had Adam Arnold on the podcast, and you can also view a tour of their facility at the Kisorganics YouTube page. My guest this week is Jared Ferguson, the greenhouse manager at Collective Elevation. He's been at Collective for over 4 years now, but prior to that, he studied environmental horticulture at Montama State University in Bozeman, during which he worked for the university's greenhouse facility and research farm, where he got his first experiences in mixing soil, amending plants, managing irrigation, and conducting IPM processes. Now on to the show. Jared, thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you for having me, Ted.
Yeah, so you've been with Collective Elevation for a little while now, and you are the fertility manager. What is your exact title?
Greenhouse manager is what I've been going with, and no one's told me no, so I think I'm going with that.
Nice.
I do the fertility management and kind of the irrigation management, and basically just taking care of the greenhouses once we got plants in there through their veg cycle and flower cycle.
Yes, and as you know, irrigation and fertility are tied very closely together.
Yes, yeah.
Can you just tell me a little bit about your experiences and what you've learned since starting here at Collective?
Yeah, I've learned a ton. So I came from the academic background, so I went to school at Montana State University, got a horticulture degree there. And kind of the biggest thing from transitioning from that over to here was just kind of figuring out how to take the big picture ideas of soil fertility and doing your soil math and everything from kind of turf grass management perspective, like large scale agriculture, vegetable farms, kind of figuring out how to combine all of that to a system that's going to work good in a soilless media in a greenhouse. So yeah, I learned a lot, specifically when I initially transitioned over just about the plant itself, because I hadn't really worked with cannabis before. So learning photoperiods, all that stuff. And then from then on, just kind of dialing in the nutrient program over time after I kind of gone through and figured out how I wanted to be doing the soil math, slowly kind of figuring out what works best for us in our greenhouses, because obviously every growing system is a little bit different. So figuring out like how to adapt what I learned through other people for our specific situation. I was able to do the soil doctor, his soil fertility course a few years ago, and that was super helpful. Just kind of like giving me a path to kind of figure out how to bridge that gap there. But yeah.
Yeah, Bryant Mason's course is a good resource for people who are interested in learning how to do their own soil fertility. It's well worth it. We do actually.
Yeah, no, it was.
Oh, I was just going to throw out a shameless plug. If you type in
Oh yeah.
Kiss Organics, all one word, I think you get a discount on it too. So um, there is that. But yeah,
Yeah,
getting
yeah.
back to it. So when you first got here, how were you guys managing fertility in the greenhouses?
So when I initially started, I got hired on as an assistant, kind of to start out. And then we had a fertility manager who was kind of transitioning out at that point. He had his own method of kind of doing things. I think he was using the soil doctor class as well as kind of a guide as far as our targets and everything go. And so we had kind of that like framework that we were using, but we were really, once he left, we were kind of basically taking old soil amendment plans that he had created and still soil testing and everything and like looking at those with the soil tests they were referencing. And then kind of using our current soil tests and kind of trying to extrapolate off of that and figure out like, okay, well, he did this for this case, so how do we adjust that for our current situation? There was a period where we were using a fertilizer mix, and so we were just kind of broadly targeting all nutrients, making sure we had fertility in every area there, which was good for a while, but I do feel like it ended up with us kind of adding too much. We were getting into situations where we had high sulfur or high magnesium, and we didn't have a way to, with this mix, to apply nitrogen without also adding that in. So from then we kind of started to transition. My first summer was about like that, where we were doing using the fertilizer mix and kind of extrapolating old data. And then going into the winter, I was able to go through that course. And with that, just kind of figure out how to start targeting specific nutrients. And from there, figuring out how to bridge the gap with my soil math to make it match up for what I wanted to be doing for like a soilless media. Because obviously there's huge differences between the soilless media versus an actual soil outdoors. And so figuring out what I need to take into account and disregard and stuff for our container grown plants. At one point we sent some soil tests off to both you and the soil doctor, and I kind of did my own like amendment plan for it and then compared it with the two and was like, okay, well, I'm not 100% accurate, but I'm not super far off. So use that to kind of double check some work and everything and keep like building up from there. Yeah. And that's kind of the initial stage.
Yeah. So for people who are unfamiliar, I just want to back up on a couple things and state that
Yeah.
collective elevation, if you want to see the facility that we're talking about, there is a YouTube tour on our Kiss Organics YouTube channel that people can go back and watch. And then a lot of the soil that you have is our commercial growers mix. That's what was in the beds, but you guys got that in years ago now. I think
Yes.
even before you were at collective. So it's
It
really your
was about,
soil at this point.
yeah, yeah. It was about right when I started. So we had two Nexus greenhouses that have had soil in them for about, I think it's about 7 years old at this point. It's very old soil. That was pre-KISS soil. I think they mixed that up themselves. And then as I started that summer, we were building out our next gen facilities, and those are the ones that we filled with the KISS soil. So those were kind of my first fall here was my first cycle through with KISS soil. But yeah, and so even within that, it's really cool to see just like wide differences between the two soils, and even between the greenhouses with that KISS soil in it, because over time we just get through microclimates and everything within the greenhouse, we start to just see different trends based off which our north greenhouse versus our south greenhouse with how they're lined up. A lot of small microclimates within the greenhouses themselves, just in the beds and everything, kind of like getting to spend the time in there to be able to observe that and actually notice it has been super, super helpful. And then we've started to kind of tailor each amendment plan towards each greenhouse and then our season and everything as well.
That's really interesting. Yeah. So one thing that when you mentioned soilless media being different than
Yes.
actual soil, what you're referencing is actually this KISS soil. So what we're calling living
Mm-hmm.
soil indoors is not actual soil. It doesn't have sand, silt, and clay
Yes,
in it.
exactly. Yeah.
It's what agronomists would call soilless media. I just in
Mm-hmm.
case people are confusing the terminology because it is confusing.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to add that. But I wanted to ask you, so you mentioned that you're soil testing. What does that actually look like in reality? Like, take me through when in the cycle you take those tests, when you get them back, and then how you use that interpretation in your as a guidance for what you're doing.
Yeah. So as far as the timing on it, We're taking it about day 56 of flower is kind of the latest I can take it and still get them back in reasonable enough time for us to do our amendment before our next cycle. So it's hard because obviously I'd rather wait later, take them right at the end of the cycle, but being commercial production, we kind of got to keep that going. So obviously they're a little less accurate with taking them earlier, but that process itself is we have a soil core probe thing that we're taking the test with. I usually go about every 8 feet in a room. I'll take a sample. Your soil test is only as good as your sample is representative of your room. So trying to get the most representative sample as I can, which is obviously you're never going to get that unless you tested the entirety of your soil volume. But making sure that I'm taking a wide range of tests from all over in the greenhouse so that I can have as representative of a sample as possible. Sending those off to Logan Labs, great lab. Usually get our results back super quickly and everything from them. And I just like the layout of how they present the data and everything on it. We are typically doing, I think it's their complete test, but it is a standard Malic 3 soil test, a saturated paste test where we're sending our own water in with it. And then they give us like our micronutrients and like our silica and our nitrate numbers and everything on that as well.
Yeah, and one thing that I've noticed, and I've talked to Bryant about this, is we've had guys test every bed individually and then also test the entire room. Maybe like 20 tests is composed of like one composite test that's mixed of all those, and they all tend to be fairly similar unless we have like one real outlier bed. Has your experience sort of agreed with that? And how many tests do you do per greenhouse, and how big approximately is your greenhouse?
So we're doing composite tests with them. In the past, we have done individual beds and sent those off, and we kind of found the same thing where we were like within 10 to 20% at the most difference between beds. And it really would be like we're testing a bed that is absolutely getting less light versus one that gets a ton of light. And that's where we're seeing like the slight differences. So for the most part, we're sending off a composite sample for our greenhouses. So we have 4 houses all together. I don't know the exact square footage of the house itself, but we have, in our smaller ones, we have 4 rows of, 84 feet by 4 feet wide by about 2 feet deep. And then in our larger greenhouses, we have 6 rows of 88 feet at about 1.5 feet deep, probably. So a little bit different volume there. Yeah.
Yeah, and so you found that one test gives you a pretty good idea of what's going on in the room, and that saves a ton of money as a grower. So if you are thinking about going this route, don't feel like you have to test every bed. You don't.
Yeah, no, I think it gives you a pretty good composite. And I would say if you feel like you have something going on in the room, like if there's a bed that's wildly behaving differently than others, then you can look into that. And then at that point, tissue testing as well, just to know what's going on inside your plants. Actually, we tissue test periodically. We don't do it every single round. It's something I'd like to do every single round, but at a certain point, you got to balance how much data are we getting and using, kind of there. But yeah, the tissue testing can be really helpful if you're in a situation like that. And in the past, we've done that. Typically, when we have a greenhouse where it's like something seems off, we'll do that. And it's usually been pretty representative of what our saturated paste test is kind of reading. As long as you are getting adequate water, getting not just adequate water, but getting a good watering program to where your plants are able to take up those plant available nutrients that you're seeing in that saturated paste test, it's usually pretty representative.
Yeah, that's a great point touching on the watering. I will just add one note that taking one test for a room is sort of predicated on the idea that you're treating all the beds exactly the same. So if you start amending all the beds individually different, I think then you're kind of forcing your hand into having to test them all.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
But how does water play a role in, well, I was going to say, how does water play a role in terms of nutrient availability? But I know that's kind of a obvious one. How do you have a real life example though of how irrigation changes have impacted available fertility in your beds, where maybe you had sufficient fertility, but it was too cold or you weren't watering properly?
Just with the microclimates kind of in the greenhouse in general, our Nexus greenhouses, they're east to west facing. The east end of the wall gets shaded out in the morning time. So there's a solid like about 6 foot section of that bed that gets considerably less light for the first few hours of the day. In those beds, which again, I guess this isn't just directly water because that's also bringing light into account, but in those beds, they always are holding water. Like those sections are holding water significantly longer than the rest of the bed itself and just that row. And with those, we will see a lot more kind of towards the end of flowering, like plants that look not as far along as the rest of the row. So plants that don't look as developed, they maybe are still a little too dark green. They almost look like they have too much nitrogen at the time. They haven't been like processing as much because they just haven't been taking up as much water due to not having as much light and also just having a more saturated environment around them. Um, and then we've also seen the case too where with underwatering as well, you kind of develop those same like things that look like nutrient deficiencies, but the soil itself might not be deficient. The plant is just not getting it because you don't have the proper environment around the plant for it to uptake those nutrients. We kind of see that just seasonal differences. We have areas in the summertime that just get blasted by sunlight and they are like at least a touch up water almost every day. And then down to the winter time, we have rooms sometimes where we'll go like 4 days without watering it. So it just really is, there's a lot of huge seasonal variability here. And that's kind of the best representation of how water availability kind of plays a role in that.
So you're not treating the whole greenhouse the exact same way when it comes to irrigation. You're basing it off of
Yeah. Mhm.
the beds. And how are you measuring that?
So we measure both through, we have a Blue Lab pulse, which does volumetric water content. That's not our main source. We use the aerometer probes, the tensiometers. And
Mhm.
so we use those. I feel like that gives us a more accurate kind of idea of what the plant itself is going through because the volumetric water content is great, but the number kind of, if you're doing a certain number dryback on that, it's really only applicable to that specific room that you found that number is like a good one for. Once you start looking at, because we do have different soils and different rooms, let's say 15% dryback in some of our zones is a lot different stress than 15% dryback would be in some other ones, just because we have
Mm.
older soil, smaller pore space, it's holding on to that water a lot more. So it might have the same volumetric water content, but that the tension that it actually takes the roots to pull that in is a lot more, and it's a lot more just osmotic stress on the roots. But yeah, the main way we're going about it is using we have barometers in every greenhouse, kind of checking those and watering based off of certain KPA numbers. And now we're transitioning into where we're going to start testing out some volumetric water content probes that will vary in the beds as well. And then kind of the process with that is going to be putting a probe in the bed and then also putting an aerometer next to it, finding out what 20 kPa on our aerometer actually is as far as dryback for our plants and kind of adjusting our numbers based off that for each room specifically rather than just the whole grow. Yeah.
That's very cool. Very cool. And I like the way you explained that. That's a very good point. I like the Blue Lab pulse meters. I mean, we sell them at KISS.
Mhm.
I think they're a really cool tool. They give you a
Yeah.
very fast number. And I like that I can
Yes. Yeah.
correlate a photo in the app with the
And
moisture
notes and
reading.
everything too. Yeah.
But
Mhm.
I totally agree. The aerometers are going to be more accurate. And I just want to highlight where you said you can't take the same percentage on that volumetric reading on
Mhm.
the pulse meter, and use it across different media
Yeah. Mhm.
and expect to get the same results, I guess. Yeah, that was a
Mhm.
really good point. So thanks for
Yeah.
highlighting.
Yeah, for sure.
One other thing that you mentioned around when you time your soil tests that I wanted to add, because I happen to just know this, that you guys keep all the amendments that you use on
Mhm.
site so that when you go to
Yes.
re-amend, you don't have to place an order with a company to or run somewhere to go get these amendments. You have them all on site and ready to go. So once you get results back, you can amend right away.
Yeah, and yeah, we have half a fertilizer store essentially in our pole barn. I maybe have gone a little crazy in my ordering in the past and gotten really hyped about some specific nutrients and ordered a lot of them, and then realized I didn't need that much.
Yeah.
So
Well,
yeah.
what are your go-tos, and what do you see yourself using? I guess the same question. What do you yourself using the most in terms of your favorite amendments and I guess trends in your
Yeah,
soil
yeah.
fertility amendments?
So it's changed a lot since over the last few years, just as I'm kind of figuring more stuff out. My main kind of idea is I want to have, for every nutrient we have, I want to have a two different sources for it if I can. That way, like say calcium, for example, if I'm only feeding gypsum and I'm also feeding potassium sulfate and maybe magnesium sulfate, I'm probably going to get too high a sulfur at some point. So making sure I also have like something like an ag sil so that I can switch off, or not an ag sil, a wolastanite for the calcium, so that I can switch off and like add calcium in a different form and kind of not take anything out of where I want it to be, just to get other nutrients in there. I would say as far as historically, our main amendments have been, we've used a lot of fish meal, soybean meal, insect frass, gypsum, sulfate of potash, as like rock dust as well. As of more recently, kind of currently right now, we're shifting some of our nitrogen towards using blood meal, feather meal as kind of our main nitrogen sources, just so we have that like standalone 1300 rather than having the phosphorus or the potassium attached to it. And the thing that I'm playing with right now that I'm really excited about is I'm taking my nitrogen goal and I'm breaking it up into portions with different breakdown rates for my fertilizer. So I'm doing like a 25% portion of kind of a blood meal, which is a quicker breakdown so that they have it more available earlier. Than like the middle section, I'm doing like a moderate breakdown at about 50% of our nitrogen goal, and then a slow breakdown as the last like 25%. So we're getting like kind of a broad spectrum of different nitrogen sources in there that'll be available at different times as the plant needs it too. So kind of trying to front load our nitrogen availability a bit, but then also have enough for them to taper through their cycle without like plummeting down to like 10 ppm or something like that.
Yeah, nitrogen is definitely the trickiest
Yeah.
mineral to manage, because a huge pool of what our nitrogen is in these soils, or in soil in general, is organic nitrogen, which you can't really
Yes.
see
Yeah.
on these tests. So, yeah, nitrogen's all a little bit of a guessing game, and I totally agree with you. We always, with our recommendations, want to have at least 2 to 3 sources of nitrogen.
Mhm.
I really like organic alfalfa meal, even though it's not
Yes.
a big nitrogen source. I just think it has a lot of good like microbial benefits and
Mhm.
other things that it does that I like to use it. But yeah, that's
We
that's
d-
that's a really good point that you brought up around having multiple sources for different amendments. Did you want
Yeah, we definitely went through a phase where we used a lot of alfalfa meal. And I use it in all of our teas and everything as part of that recipe. And when we do some like supplemental feedings throughout the cycle, I'll use it there. Um, but yeah, as you're saying, it's really low nitrogen percentage, but you do get carbon from it. It's a very good carbon source and everything, and just organic source for the plants. Yeah, and we've used a lot of kelp meal as well. We've used basically most of the organic inputs you can think of. We have a few bags of them out there. So um, yeah, kind of gone through a lot of different sources. Wolastanite's one that we've been using a lot more recently, just because we were getting high sulfur in some greenhouses, and I was like, all right, I need to figure out how to go around this and not keep adding sulfur, because at a certain point you're just creating osmotic stress for your plants, and it's just gonna create a more stressful environment for them. And we have enough other stressors that I want to try to limit as much of that as possible on my end. It's hard
to?
to kind of use stress to like try to do crop steering if they're always stressed. So trying to figure out how to, yeah, keep them in a good spot and make sure that, again, whatever I'm amending, I've got multiple options so that I can really kind of per soil test kind of customize what we're doing each time.
Yeah, sulfur is an interesting one because typically I find with our soil tests is we tend to range more alkaline because of a lot of our inputs are cations.
Mm-hmm.
We're using a lot
Yeah.
of calcium, a lot of potassium, and so we tend to push the pH tends to be high, so the sulfur really helps balance that. But and we don't really see any issues with sulfur toxicities per se.
Mm-hmm.
But you brought up the big issue with sulfur, which is essentially when you have very excessive levels, and I've seen
Mm-hmm.
thousands of ppm of sulfur on soil tests. What can happen is your soluble salt, the EC of your soil, becomes higher, and then it's harder for the plant to essentially acquire those nutrients because of the osmotic pressure around the
Mm-hmm.
roots. So yeah, just wanted to further explain what
Yeah.
you were talking about, because I think that's a really fascinating concept. So
Yeah.
as a soil fertility manager, you're always doing this dance of balance with your nutrients.
Yeah.
That being said, something that Bryant always said that I really appreciate, and I take the same philosophy, is I always start with sufficiency and
Mm-hmm.
then balance. What has sort of been your approach with this whole process?
I would say very similar as well. Like taking into account both the saturated and the standard tests, trying to make sure that we have obviously sufficient available nutrients to the plants, but then making sure that we're in a situation where if I am wildly out of whack on my cations, like if my ratios are not down in there, if I have like nuclear high, which this hasn't happened too much, but if I have out of whack like calcium or anything like that, where it's kind of sitting high as far as like our ratios of the rest of the cations, it maybe makes me kind of pause for a second about adding to try to up my saturated paste test. Because if we are at a high situation there, then we do have it in the soil. It's just about getting it plant available and like mineralized over and everything, or demineralized. Yeah, so it's definitely kind of sufficiency first is the main idea, and then without completely like disregarding what's going on in our standard test and making sure we're not getting into a situation where we're going to run into issues with nutrients being tied up and not become plant available. Yeah.
Nice, nice. And do you have any examples of where you saw something on a soil test that was then reflected in the plant that you were able to address or correct in a way that increased yields or fertility or plant
Yes.
health?
High nitrogen at harvest. I have
Uh,
definitely put too much when I first started kind of running the nutrient program. There's a period where I was definitely throwing too much nitrogen in there. We're seeing still plants that weren't fully, they're full, not fully green, but they were still a lot greener than we wanted them to be at the end. And then coming back on our soil test around like 50 ppm of nitrate at the end of it, which isn't where I want to be. Trying to shoot more towards ending at like 20 to 30 has been what I've seen like do really well for us. And then just kind of lowering that top end nitrogen goal down a bit to try to ease us into that lower, finishing at that lower area. That's been a really big thing in winter specifically, just because we go from having such intense sunlight in the summertime to when we're in January, February here. If we got curtains closed up, we're sitting maybe a little bit under what we should be with light by a few hundred par. And so we're definitely processing less nitrogen. And so I have to change my thinking for sure on our summertime runs versus our wintertime runs. And now I'm kind of coming up with different sets of parameters for the two of them, treating the summers a lot differently, pushing more nitrogen, kind of pushing just more nutrients in general, because we're going to go through more of them. And then in the wintertime, just having a really light hand there, just like getting them up to what I feel like sufficiency is and trying to just write it out and watch the plants.
Yeah, I know Bryant has talked about how nitrogen availability, especially outdoors, is tied fairly closely with with soil temperature. And in indoors, even I would assume in your greenhouses, it's a little bit colder in the winter than it is in the summer naturally, and so you probably would have less nitrogen cycling. And we routinely see soil tests where you're at 1, 2, 3 ppm of nitrate at the end of the cycle, and conversely, those plants, it's like I know you left some yield on the table and definitely
Mm-hmm.
some plant health because the plant
Yeah.
completely ran out of nitrogen. So hitting that sweet spot, which I'd agree with you, 20, 30 ppm is a great finishing spot for nitrates. It makes a huge difference in overall yield.
Yes, yeah. I know, like you said, it's kind of like it's threading that needle where it's you have to find that balance to where you're not ending too completely like just zapped out of nitrogen. Like you have to end with a certain amount still to where you're not getting, you don't ever, or for me personally, like I don't ever want to see, I want to see actual natural senescence from the plants where they are fading because of their age and because of their maturity level, not yellowing out because they're depleted of nitrogen towards the end of their cycle. And we've definitely had periods of that too, where it's like intense sun and everything, and they process through that nutrient quicker than we maybe expected them to, and we start to see maybe instead of 2 weeks before harvest where we start to see color changes happen, we start to see that happen 3 or 4 weeks before like some yellowing start. And so definitely figuring out over time, like my initial first year here, we had a lot of high nutrients, a lot of low nutrients, and it's just been trying to slowly just bring that to balance over time. But yeah,
That's very honest of you to admit that. I
yeah, yeah.
appreciate that.
It's a
Um,
learning process for sure. And anyone that's like, oh, I for sure know the 100% correct way to do this is probably projecting a bit. But
Yeah, these soil tests are not always 100% accurate too. So you kind of have
Mhm.
to take them with a grain of salt. And I always like to err a little bit low because you can always
Hmm.
add more, but you can't
Yes.
really take away. So
Yeah. Hmm.
what is your approach if you are mid-cycle and you realize that you're low in, and we can just stay with nitrogen just to keep it
Yeah.
simple. What's your approach to combating that?
So, especially for mid-cycle, it's very, very like I'm being very cautious with how much I'm trying to add through that. We add a bit through teas and stuff, but it's a pretty small amount, so it's hard to account for too much with that. But we've been more recently, we worked with David Perron, and he kind of introduced us to this like whole slurry method of applying nutrients down. So more recently, over the summertime, we'd been applying just with water through a pump and through a hose, or some nitrogen early into flower, like the first week of flower or so, if we felt like we needed it to kind of give them that bump. But it's really hard. There's a really short window where once you're into flower, you got a few weeks to where you can amend and not be too far along into it. So it's a really kind of delicate time frame for the plants. Typically, it's been in the past before we started doing the slurries, it was just kind of like top dressing some fish meal and stuff. But again, that's like for me, if you're seeing a deficiency and then applying nutrients, it's almost too late because for me, I feel like it's you're waiting until you're seeing like kind of the negative side effect of not having something before adjusting it. And so
Yeah.
for the most part, I try to stay like proactive rather than reactive with that. But again, there's the needle that you got to thread there. Um, and then again, if you're top dressing a nutrient, then it's you still have to wait for that to break down, become available to the plants. So there's still kind of even once you amend, there's like a few more days at a minimum of time where it's still not getting that yet. So I think the slurry's been really good as far as just helping us kind of disperse our nutrients a lot easier with a lot less like manual labor put into it. As far as our like flips go, our in between cycles, kind of a re-amend process between cycles, we've taken that from being like a 4 or 5 person job that takes about the same amount of hours down to a just me job that takes about 3 hours. So it's been really helpful in that regard. And then obviously too, kind of not exposing as many people to the dust and everything that comes off of these. Like even if you're wearing good PPE and everything, if you're exposing yourself to wollastonite and stuff like that on the regular, it's not great for you. So trying to kind of limit I'm basically the only one working with nutrients now. I know the proper PPE I need to be wearing when I'm working with them and everything. And so it's kind of helped us simplify that a lot.
That's great. So what does what does your process look like for re-amending? Because you mentioned you top dress. Are you mixing the nutrients into the soil when you re-amend, or are you top dressing them? How does the slurry method? Can you
Yeah.
describe that a little more too, and for
Yeah,
people who
for
aren't
sure.
familiar?
Yeah. So, previous to using that method, we were just kind of applying the nutrients to the top of the soil. And then we would usually just kind of like, we just call it like a scratching them in basically, where we're kind of trying to make sure we're getting them mixed in with the top 3 inches of the soil layer. About once a year, we usually take some soil out and add some peat moss back in or something. And then we'll do like a more of a full, like kind of till at that point. But for the most part, we were just scratching into the top surface, making sure we weren't having things kind of cake up. With the slurry itself, it works really good at kind of like dispersing it on its own already. A lot of our soluble nutrients just kind of get moved throughout the soil. And then there's a lot less. We, again, basically just come by and scratch it into that first little top layer after doing the slurry amendment. But for the process itself, it's kind of, I get the soil test back, go through, analyze them, obviously, like look at, all right, do I need to leach these beds first off before anything else? If I don't need to leach or anything, if we're looking good there, then it's looking at pH adjustments or like soil structure adjustments if we need to do anything like adding any other media or anything to it. And then kind of going down and just looking at our obviously our macronutrients, our NPK, looking at calcium, magnesium, sulfur, and everything. Those are the ones I'm like most focused on. Obviously, those are the ones that have the biggest impact. Really making sure we shore up those holes. And also taking into account our micronutrients and our trace minerals. Those are just ones where I'm very wary to make adjustments because you mess that up, then you mess the soil up. So, um,
Absolutely.
yeah. So, and then kind of now what we've been doing recently too is adding a bit of biochar in between each round, adding some compost in between each round to try to just add a little more back into the soil from what we're taking out throughout that cycle.
A couple questions. So,
Yes,
question
yeah.
number one: if you're just scratching it in and not, well, I guess we'll use the word tilling because
Yeah.
that's what people are familiar with. What about the bulk density of the soil? So over time, with water, with everything, that soil is compressing down. That's why when we, if you put soil out, fresh soil out in your garden bed at the beginning of this garden season, you come back out at the end and it's dropped 4 inches, and you're like, where did
Yeah,
that
yeah.
soil go? It's compressing in bulk density, which limits the amount of air and water, that the pore space essentially in that soil. Do you
Mhm.
find that to be an issue at all with your method, or just do you
Yeah.
get like an annual reset?
So with that, we do kind of a once a year, we pull some soil, add some peat moss typically back in, add some aeration in if we feel like we need it and stuff too. And then we do a big, massive kind of full bed till. That usually helps up the soil volume just from incorporating that air and everything back into it. And then we definitely do see like a settling. For the most part, a lot of our, so like I'll use zones 1 and 2, for example. Those are the ones without the kiss soil. Those ones have been processed so much that at a certain point, it almost looks like we're just growing in worm castings. So we have a
Mm-hmm.
lot of kind of bigger pore space in those. We definitely do see settling still and everything, but I feel like we reset it on a quick enough base, or on a regular enough basis, to where we're not getting too many issues with large amount of compaction. Like we're still getting good root penetration and everything. Still getting good water penetration and stuff, but it's definitely not ideal, obviously, to have like that soil get super compact. But I feel like we're kind of on a good schedule to where we're, while balancing the amount of labor we're putting into it, and also balancing kind of trying to not disturb too much of the soil structure, since we do have a lot of fungus and everything growing within our beds. I feel like we're on a good middle ground of not fully like no till, but not fully complete till every time. So we're kind of trying to shoot that gap where it's like do what's best for our soil structure and balance out also our labor costs and everything with it, and also trying to give the soil time to establish itself as kind of more of a, obviously it's not the same as an outdoor soil, but as more of an ecosystem within itself.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. You don't want to disturb the microorganisms. I know that's the big reason people don't like tilling or soil
Mhm.
disturbance on any level. So,
And I'm like, I'm in the middle on that because I'm not sure like how much it would take a lot of monitoring and testing things to see how much that actually messes with us. Like we would have to not till some beds, and kind of see what happens over time. I definitely feel like we get better root penetration after we do our big turn and everything, and after we lighten that soil up. And I think it's good too, just as far as like the stratification of our nutrients and everything in there, because you don't want to get to the point where if you don't till it ever, you're going to end up getting layers of nutrients that are more and less mobile than the other ones. And so I think it is good to kind of just refresh the soil, mix that all back up, and kind of redisperse all those nutrients as well.
yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of soil disturbance, as you probably know.
Yeah.
So I've talked about it on this podcast.
Mhm.
I think these microbes are more resilient than people give them credit for.
I do as well. Yeah.
But
Hmm.
I see really happy plants in soil that is grown in no-till indoor beds, as
Hmm.
well as soil that's been highly disturbed. So I think there's a lot of ways to grow this plant, and I
Yeah.
think you kind of
Yeah,
bridge a
for
good
sure.
gap there of kind of maybe addressing both ways. And so now what you're doing, you're saying, is maybe less soil disturbance because you're taking your soil recommendations that
Hmm.
you've set based on your targets. You're taking that, fish meal, gypsum, last night combo of inputs, putting them into like a giant vat,
Hmm.
agitating it, and then essentially just putting it all out with water in the form of a
Hmm.
slurry over those beds. Is that accurate?
Yeah, pretty accurate. Yeah, yeah, that's essentially the process. And through doing it, we've obviously like I've found something. Some nutrients work better with it, some don't. Like if I'm using soft rock phosphate, it's hard to get that to not settle on the bottom. There's definitely a carrying capacity too for the size of the tanks that we have, and how much fertilizer we can put in with a certain amount of water. So it's like been finding that out. And again, like alfalfa, for example, we ended up just a lot of it would just kind of float to the top. And so then we wouldn't get very much. We would get a lot of like what looked like alfalfa stems coming out initially, and then we would get no alfalfa kind of coming out for a while. And then as the tank emptied, we'd start to get more of the kind of lighter material. So kind of going through that and figuring out which nutrients are better for it and not. And there's some things that we apply like dry still, like I apply rock dust still just by like putting it out dry and everything. And same with like if I am using soft rock phosphate. Yeah. And so just kind of figuring out it's not like every single fertilizer is going to work great with it. And obviously we could probably do some of our heavier amendments if we had less total amendments in there with the water. Um, yeah, for the most part, it's been really helpful just being able to kind of get that done a lot quicker. And again, I feel like it's a more even process as long as we have the appropriate agitation in our tanks. It's been a trial and error process of just kind of figuring out. It's like, all right, do I need one pump, two pumps during this? Which way do I need to orient them? And like all the little things that go into that. So
Yeah, so you kind of addressed a couple of my questions. Like, how do you, some things just aren't great to use with this method and you have to apply them
no,
separately.
yeah.
So that was question number one. Question number two was sort of like, you said you feel like it's more even. And in my head, I was thinking about, well, if you're only taking one soil test, then how would you know if it's even or not for the, aggregate for the whole room? You
Yes,
wouldn't know if
yeah.
your fertility is even. But I've also seen your rooms and your plants look very evenly fertilized. I mean, they look very homogeneous in terms of the amount of fertility that they're getting. I don't see like, oh, there's a ton of potassium here and none over here based on plant response. So it must be working. How do you manage like, how long do you water a certain bed? Like, do you just go, do you count to five and then go to the next bed and, or next walk 10 steps or yeah, how do you get that part of an even flow rate out onto the bed?
So just watching, it's more just going by gallon markers on the tanks themselves. And we're applying a lot. So per row, I'm applying about 100 gallons of water overall per row. And those are the 84-foot rows to 88-foot, depending on which greenhouse we're in. And so typically just checking back in, seeing where my numbers at on that and everything. And it definitely is not it's not 100% like I know I got exactly the same amount spread across the whole room, but it's just about kind of minimizing as much difference as we can there. Yeah, and then just making sure basically I'm going by the gallon numbers. I've got a pretty consistent for the first 2.5 years for when I started here, I was hand watering everything. And I got pretty good pace down on my hand water to where it's like I move it
Nice.
about the same speed with everything. So it's just kind of keeping that same pace with it, making sure you're trying to distribute it as evenly as possible. Yeah.
So you're just finishing up with your tank right as you hit the end of the row, kind of at the end of the bed.
Mhm.
Um,
Yep. At the end, so I use like one 250 gallon or a one 200-gallon tank. It's 250 gallons, but I usually fill it up to 200 per like two beds or two rows essentially. And so I can kind of do one up, one back on one row, and then one up, one back on the next row. And that's usually right about at the end of the 200.
and that saves you a ton of time in
Yeah,
labor and
tons. Yes.
application. Awesome.
Mhm.
Well, cool.
Yeah,
That's a
ton of
very
time.
handy tip that people can experiment with. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely a lot of trial and error with it. We have to use a giant hose for it, so that's one thing where if you tried to use a regular garden hose, I think it'd get clogged up pretty easily. So yeah, just finding the right equipment and everything. And then a thing we currently have like square totes that we're doing it in. If I had my dream set up for it, it'd probably be a round tank just to help minimize settling in corners and everything.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's helped reduce a ton of labor. It's helped, and mostly for like the rest of the cultivation crew, all the guys that have to clean the greenhouse right after they just got done harvesting, got to pull root balls and everything. That's already a very long, labor intensive process. So if we can take away a day of packing nutrients and tilling beds, that's super helpful for them. Yeah, so being able to take that kind of like off their plates, and then I like having the control in it, being able to apply it myself because at least then if something goes wrong, I did it. So we know what happened with it. Where in the past we've had some hot spots in beds where it's like some beds are mixed really, really well, and then you find a whole pile of gypsum in one bed that's just barely under the soil surface that's turned into a giant
Yeah.
cake. So yeah,
Yeah.
make it just as far as the uniform application. Yeah, I feel like it's really helpful.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, I really appreciate your time today. Was there any other things you wanted to chat about here before we sign up for
Um,
share?
Nothing that comes to mind too much. Yeah, I guess that's just essentially kind of how the process has developed over time. See anything else with that? No, I think that kind of covers it. We've gone through different iterations of what we've been doing. We've gone through. I think the main thing is just like trial and error is a very important process of figuring out if you're doing things right. And like we varied all the way from like teeing, for example. At one point we were teeing once a week, all the way down to only 4 times a cycle. And so just like figuring out, having the freedom to be able to like test different things and see what's working best for you and adjust it, and not having kind of a like, don't be stuck to one thing, is I think the biggest thing that's been really helpful for me. I feel like there's a lot in the cannabis industry where it's like you have to do this way or you're entirely wrong. Every single grow is different. There's 1,000 different ways to grow plants. It all comes down to what is aligning with you ethically, what aligns with your business and everything, and just in your specific rooms themselves. Because again, if you're growing under in a room with HPSs versus in a room with LEDs versus in a greenhouse with natural sun, like those by themselves, just light is such a big change in environment that there is going to be a whole domino effect of everything else. So just really having an open mind to kind of tailoring your system to your specific grow, I think is really, really important, and not being stuck on specific ideas.
That did bring up two other questions that I had that I want to get in before
Yeah.
you sign off now. You've brought up teas a few times in this
Yes.
conversation. Can you just explain what that means?
Yeah. So just a microbe tea. So just essentially mixing, we use a mix of worm castings and compost, mixing those with water, a food source. We use molasses, so like a sugar source. I typically add in some hydrolysate just to help with kind of the bubbling and everything, as well, and food for the microbes as well, and then some kelp and alfalfa. And essentially the idea is we're taking the microbes from our compost and from our worm castings, we're giving them a food source, we're aerating them in a liquid to help them just reproduce, kind of up the concentration of how many microbes we have in that tea. And then we're watering into the beds to help apply it into the beds to help speed up our process of kind of cycling our nutrients and everything and make them more plant available. And again, I'm not still not sure what the right ratio is to how many you're doing throughout a cycle, but we've gone everything from once a week when I first started down to like 4 times a cycle, and just kind of been messing with that and testing it and seeing how we've also changed tea recipes, but just messing with it and seeing like what that affects in the plants. Yeah, so just basically giving the plants a boost of microbes to help kind of process those nutrients in the soil a little quicker.
So you're making aerated compost teas. Yes.
Yes, yeah, yeah.
And
Yes. Long-winded way of saying it,
no,
yeah.
people might not be familiar with the term or the difference between that and say a compost extract. I'm literally
Yes, yeah.
staring at my microscope here, and don't let me forget when I come out for the conference. If I drive out in September for the conference that we're putting on at your
Yeah,
facility, I will bring my microscope and we can look at the teas and
that'd be
maybe
great, yeah.
make some recipe adjustments at that point too.
Yeah.
See what's
No,
going
that'd
on.
be great because yeah, because again, it's we think we're doing the right thing. We hope we're doing the right thing by applying the teas, but unless you scope it and are able to actually identify what's in there, it's kind of a mystery. So yeah, that'd be helpful.
That'd be fun. All right. Well, hey, thanks again, Jared. Oh, last question. You disappeared.
Oh, you still there?
Oh,
Oh,
you're
there you are.
back.
Okay.
Okay. Last question was your outdoor runs.
Yes, yeah.
You guys do those you handle your fertility a little different on those, right?
Yes, yeah, yeah, for sure. And it really depends on which zone we're in outside, because we have everything from plants in pots to plants in beds that have soilless media on top of the soil in the ground, and then all the way to just growing in the field, in just straight up soil. So yeah, we kind of tailor it to each zone. We test all those as well. But yeah, definitely kind of approaching the amendments differently there. I'm upping my nitrogen quite a bit since we are in like a full sun, full season setting. But again, that's kind of determined by our pot size too. With some of our, if we're growing in 25-gallon pots, we end up having to feed them a little more often throughout the cycle. But with our in-bed plants and with our in-ground plants, we can usually get through the season off of one kind of initial feeding and then just monitoring them from then on. But yeah, definitely upping our fertility overall with a focus on upping our nitrogen to kind of the high end of what I would ever apply. And yeah, it's been we're dialing things in still, but it's been working well. We've been getting better crops each year. So now that we're growing kind of a big field of auto flowers. definitely have to treat those a little bit differently than everything else because they're kind of queuing into flower immediately. So it's not necessarily, you don't necessarily need as much of the nutrients you'd be focusing on for like a longer veg period. And then also we're amending into soil. So I got to take into account the cation exchange capacity. The organic matter is actual organic matter in this case, where it's been broken down over thousands of years, not just like organic matter in the form of peat. Um, but yeah, so a lot more to take into account with the outdoor soils, but yeah, kind of same process still.
Nice. I remember coming out and seeing your outdoor plants, and they looked phenomenal. They were huge. Like they were trees. It
They
was
got
great to
they got
see.
too big.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was fun to see though. So awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you
Yeah, for
coming on
sure.
the show. We'll talk soon.
No, I appreciate it. Yeah. Thank you. See you soon. Yeah.